Thank you so much for being here this afternoon on our webinar on supporting the shift to 3D learning, why it matters, and what helps. We're so excited to talk about this topic today. And just as all of you are introducing yourselves in the chat and sharing where you're from, Daniel and I will go ahead and return the favor. So my name is Emily Miller. My pronouns are she, her. Prior to working at Inner Orbit, I was a high school chemistry for 10 years in Minnesota, like I mentioned. My time in the classroom, I taught an alternative learning program. I taught regular chem, honors chem, so lots of ways to teach a lot of different kids, a lot of different ways. I did a lot of work with the NGSS in my time in the classroom. I got to be a PLC lead and lead a lot of data-driven dialogue. I love data. And now I get to work with districts to help them pilot and implement Inner Orbit within their districts. And one of the things I am most excited about for this summer is to be on the lake. We have a cabin up north, and spending any time out on the water in any way is just my favorite thing to do. Our colleague Julia Mota is here as well. She is going to be hanging out in the chat and answering any questions that anybody has, as well as dropping some relevant links. And I'll go ahead and pass it off to Daniel to introduce himself now.
Thanks, Emily, and hi, everyone. My name's Daniel Jackson. I've spent about 11 years in education as a curriculum director, high school biology, and middle school science teacher. I taught in an international school in Colombia, and I was a global education and Fulbright GGC scholar in Morocco. And I currently partner with school leaders and teachers new to Inner Orbit. And that sounds awesome this summer, Emily. I'm excited for similar things. I got to get to a lake, but really Cedar Point, which is on Lake Erie, I guess. Maybe that's my lake. Super excited to get to those roller coasters this summer.
I'll have to tell you my Cedar Point story at another time, Daniel. But my husband and I went there on one of the rainiest, saddest days ever. So we have a bone to pick where we want to go back there and actually try it again. All right. So on to what we're here to do today. So our webinar is on supporting the shift to 3D learning, why it matters, and what helps. So our objective here today is to help educators better understand why the shift to three-dimensional learning matters, and then explore practical supportive strategies for helping teachers implement the NGSS aligned instruction with confidence. So we're going to be here for about an hour today. We'll just briefly discuss what is Inner Orbit, just so you know why we are, who we are, and what we do. Then we're going to spend a little bit of time just talking about what's sparked the shift to NGSS. If you've been in education for 10, 15 years now, you know this has been a really big movement. So why did it initially start? Then we'll just do a brief overview on the foundations of the NGSS, so like what makes it what it is. Then we're going to talk about some classroom realities of the shift to the NGSS and how it can be challenging. And then from there, we're going to talk about some practical supports for NGSS implementation, specifically referencing the guide to implementing the next generation science standards. And then we'll finish off by talking about some positive impacts of NGSS implementation before we call it a day. And just as a warning to all of you, I don't know if it's just like the fun summer energy or what, but I had a lot of fun with GIFs in this webinar, and so did Daniel. So please go ahead and ride along on our GIF train, and hopefully it sparks a little bit of joy for you, as I'm sure all of you are navigating the end of year crazy. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Daniel, and he's going to tell us a little bit about what Inner Orbit is.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily. So what is Inner Orbit? At Inner Orbit, we like to say there are three core components to what we do. We have phenomena, we have assessments, and detailed reports. Our high integrity 3D assessments at Inner Orbit are designed to provide meaningful and actionable student data so you can make informed instructional decisions with confidence. We also make the NGSS accessible for both teachers and students through innovative approaches to sense making. That means we don't just drop students straight into these complex 3D questions. Instead, we use scaffolded prompts that move students from more basic, one-dimensional, content-focused understanding toward those larger three-dimensional questions. And we also provide guidance, supporting resources, and professional development to help you reach your NGSS goals, just like this session we're doing today. There'll be a link dropped in the chat in just a moment. If you're interested in learning more about Inner Orbit, feel free to fill out the interest form. And from there, we'll share additional information and show you how you all can try Inner Orbit within your districts. And although it may say start a pilot, we know it may not be the best time of year to start the pilot for some of you. It's mostly acting as an interest form just to let us know. And all right, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Emily, to talk about what sparked the shift in NGSS for science education.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And my keyboard was lagging there a little bit, so bear with me as I attempt to continue clicking through these slides without issues. So Before we kind of dive into actual NGSS implementation and the challenges and then the supports to help it happen, we kind of just wanted to go way back to the beginning and talk about what sparked the shift to begin with. So, science education really felt a need to evolve because the demands of colleges, careers, and society have evolved. Employers were increasingly needing workers who could think critically, solve complex problems, analyze information, and apply knowledge in new situations. This was happening in tandem with some growing concerns around the United States having students who are ready for STEM. We were having some declining international competitiveness when it came to science and math, and there was fewer and fewer students entering the STEM pathway. So with employers needing more of these critical thinking and problem-solving skills, and while also seeing this decline in STEM overall, the question really started to become, are we preparing students to just remember science, or are we helping students to actually think about and use science? So with this idea, there kind of came this reflection into how do students learn science best? And traditional science instruction really emphasized memorization over application. So, mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. I remember having to memorize the periodic table, like things like this. And really, that's just having students recalling it and not actually using it. And without having that ability to actually use and apply science, that is where some of that needing to solve complex problems and thinking critically may have been lacking. So, as the framework for K-12 science education, which is kind of the framework for the NGSS, as this research was done, what they really found is that students develop deeper understanding when they can ask questions, when they can investigate phenomena, when they can analyze data, and they can develop their own explanations and actually engage in scientific practices. Which I don't know about y'all, but when I see that, I'm like, well, that makes sense. If we want them to actually understand science, they have to physically get in it and do it and not just be told facts and information. So, with this idea of knowing how students understand science and how they can develop a deeper understanding, the NGSS was then designed to respond to this need. So, the NGSS was really built around the idea that all students deserve opportunities to think and investigate and make sense of the world like scientists and engineers do. The goal was then to create science learning that is deeper, more coherent, more connected, and more relevant. So when we're thinking about what this actually looks like, the idea with the NGSS is that science education will look less about learning ideas that are disconnected and not including phenomena to having systems our students are thinking and modeling to explain phenomena. So they have to actually try to figure something out. Rather than direct instruction solely from the teacher, there's going to be more of students actually conducting investigations and actually solving problems and discussing rather than there just being one correct answer that the teacher poses that students need to figure out. Now, science classrooms are going to be more about students discussing open-ended questions and trying to figure out evidence to generate their own claims. Less textbooks, more multiple sources of information, less worksheets, more writing journals and reports and posters and doing presentations, and less oversimplification of activities, and rather giving supports for all students to really engage in sophisticated science and engineering practices. So, now that we've talked a little bit about what sparked the shift and looking at the research to understand how students develop a deeper understanding of science and kind of having an idea of what it's going to look like, that is where the NGSS was then born. So if you're an NGSS expert, that's a tongue twister, please spare me just a moment or two just to review some of the key foundations of the NGSS, just to ensure we're all on the same page before we start actually talking about some classroom realities of implementing the NGSS, and then talking about how we can actually support teachers and educators successfully with the shift. So when the NGSS was developed, they came up with 7 key conceptual shifts, some ideas of how the NGSS was going to shift science instruction and be different. So first, this idea that science education should reflect the interconnected nature of science as it is practiced and experienced in the real world. So kind of stripping away this idea of science living in silos. You've got chemistry, you've got biology, you've got physics, and understanding that all of this is interconnected and that they work together. The NGSS are student performance expectations, not curriculum. So making sure that this is more expectations that we have for how students should perform and not an outlined curriculum that should be followed. The science concepts in the NGSS build coherently from K-12, so there's vertical alignment within them. This really focuses again on that deeper understanding of content and the application of content. So rather than learning a lot all at once, just a little, focusing on deeper understanding and applying that understanding. Also, ensuring that science and engineering are integrated in the NGSS. Those come out with the SCPs that we'll talk about here in a moment. And really that the NGSS's purpose is and its design is to prepare students for college, career, and citizenship. And finally, the NGSS are Common Core standards that are aligned with ELA and math. So to make sure that this is all the education that students are receiving is all aligned and work together. So now that we have an understanding of some of those conceptual shifts that the NGSS had in mind, now let's talk about what it actually looks like. So the first thing is prior to the NGSS, a lot of science standards looked something like this. Like we mentioned, it was a lot more recall, a lot more fact-based, a lot more just kind of like disseminating information and students memorizing it. The big shift with the NGSS is now there are performance expectations. So these represent what students should be able to do to demonstrate their understanding. So we'll do a deeper dive into a performance expectation here in a moment. But the key thing to think about this is rather than what students should know, performance expectations focus rather on what students should be able to do to demonstrate their understanding. When we're looking at these performance expectations, each one is going to be rooted in three primary dimensions. The first of which being the disciplinary core idea or the DCI. This is the content portion of the standard. This is like information students need to know. This is really similar to what science education used to look like. Like we still got to teach students like what the organelles are, right? In order for them to understand how cells like behave and interact with each other. So in this performance expectation here, this is a third grade performance expectation for life science. And the DCI, the disciplinary core idea, is all about adaptation. So this would be content and information we would teach our students that habitats can affect organism survival, and they may need to adapt if they would like to survive. The other dimension that is integrated into all performance expectations is the science and engineering practice or the SCP. This was a real thing that was lacking before. This is the skill or the thing that students have to do. Because remember, with all these performance expectations, students need to do something to demonstrate their understanding. So it's not enough for students to know that polar bears can't live in a desert. They need to be able to construct an argument with evidence to show that they understand polar bears can't live in a desert. And actually, now that I'm saying that, I'm just realizing that Antarctica is kind of like a desert. Wait, are polar bears in Antarctica? Oh, okay, I'm going on a tangent, excuse me. So the last dimension then incorporated within the NGSS is the cross-cutting concepts. And this really focuses on the interconnectedness part of science that the NGSS really wanted to focus on. For this cross-cutting concept or this CCC, it's cause and effect. So this idea of cause and effect is that regardless if you're in kindergarten looking at biology or if you're in high school looking at nuclear physics, cause and effect is going to be a theme that interconnects all of these things to one another. So this idea that habitats cause certain organisms to survive well or not. So with all these performance expectations being created around these three dimensions, we ensure that one, students know the content they still need to know. There's an incorporated skill in science and engineering practice to show them to apply what they're learning. And there's a cross-cutting concept to reinforce the interconnectedness that science education should have. Now, in practice, this looks like something we call sense making. So sense making occurs when students connect their previously developed ideas, abilities, and experiences together to address uncertainty presented in a phenomena, figure out why a phenomena occurs, or figure out potential solutions or ask further questions. So as teachers, our job is to teach our students skills, to teach them content, and to teach them how to think, and to teach them how all of science is interconnected. And then phenomena comes in, which is another grounding foundation of the NGSS. The phenomena makes it real world, so there's a real world application. And two, this is where students need to think critically, because this phenomena or problem in theory is something they've never seen before. So they need to take what has been taught to them and apply it to something brand new. In the process of applying what they've learned, they then see how everything is interconnected, how the cross-cutting concepts connect to the content, how the SCP and the skills can reinforce what I know and demonstrate the knowledge and understanding. And this little web right here, at least to me, is a great kind of like one snapshot of what we're trying to have students achieve as they're trying to successfully go through the NGSS. Now, all this is great, but reality doesn't make it look as nice and as simple as this graphic does. So now that we have an understanding of the foundations of the NGSS and what sparked the shift, Daniel's now going to take some time to talk about some of the actual classroom realities that happen when trying to actually implement this model in the classroom.
Yeah, exactly. And because those are big shifts, like from standards to performance expectations or representation to sense making, we want to make sure we're addressing the realities of NGSS implementation, what's actually happening in classrooms, and what the experience is often like when teachers try to make this shift. There can certainly be some challenges and barriers. I've heard many comments like this from science teachers that appear on the screen there. And as a former science teacher ourselves, we can certainly relate to these comments. Asking teachers to change how they teach and how they get evaluated is a big ask. We definitely see that and we hear you. If we can, just for a few minutes before we move on, we'd like for you to drop one challenge you've personally faced or facing with the NGSS in your district or classroom. So we'll take just a few moments if you want to add in the chat. What's one challenge you face with NGSS implementation?
And I saw when people were introducing themselves, we have a mixture of instructional coaches and teachers and administrators. Take this from your perspective and from your lens. So, whether you are supporting educators to implement it in their classrooms or you yourself have been in the classroom, if you wouldn't mind sharing some of your challenges, like Daniel mentioned, that would be great. We'll take about a minute to do that. Rebecca, I hear you. The assessment piece is huge. And if any of y'all have tried to tackle writing and creating 3D assessments, it is gnarly, which, spoiler, is one of the reasons why we here at Orbit exist to try to help with that load. Like I said, we'll take a little bit more time just to see if we have any other thoughts that pop in the chat. Yep, just new to it. Like if you haven't done it before, like what does it look like? How do I do it? And even though it's been around for 10, 15 years, when you think about the span of education, that really isn't that long. Finding good phenomena. That one, specifically as a former high school chemistry teacher, I really struggled with. You know, if you're talking about the five different types of reactions and you're talking about synthesis and single replacement and double replacement, how can I find unique real world phenomena to keep referencing to when it comes to these like intricate chemical reactions? Yes. So, especially, I've heard a lot from elementary level teachers the struggle because there's so much focus at the elementary level on math and ELA, as there should be. But when there's so much focus and attention there, it can be really hard then to be like, wait, I need just as much support, I feel like, with science and how to implement this correctly too. And depending on what experience your students have had prior to coming into your classroom, how do you meet them where they're at while also trying to get them where they need to go? Time, yep. If all teachers could have one thing, it would be time. Thank you so much for asking. Yes, we will send out a recording of this webinar tomorrow. And if you would like to see the slide deck as well, just let us know and we can send you a copy of that too. Thank you so much for sharing all this. This was super helpful.
Yeah, those are all really good responses. Thank you all for sharing those. Definitely with the time and phenomena, making the assessments, doing it over, making sure that they're valid, reliable. Definitely some challenges. I appreciate you all sharing those. The next part, so when teachers feel overwhelmed, some things that we see happens is there can be simplification, and teachers can often resort to keeping just the content and cutting the science practices and the cross-cutting concepts. The problem is that's exactly what makes the NGSS different, those science and engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts. And when students struggle for the first time, it can look like a behavior problem. But really, disengaged students act out, engaged ones don't, what the research finds. And when prior knowledge is missing, that gap travels up the grades from prior years. So you see some different issues with the amount that the NGSS requires, the challenges when students are new to the NGSS and teachers as well that can result in behavior issues, and then also the gap coming from maybe prior years if everyone's not on board and used to teaching the NGSS, and also the support and resources needed to teach the NGSS. Another reality can be challenging, that is the core of the shift, which is sense making. On the left is representation, and that is when students recall what they've been told. That is what many are used to in science education and where we are shifting from. On the right is sense making, which is when a student uses what they know to figure out something on their own. This is the goal of the NGSS. It may seem like a harder ask, but with the right support, all students can show growth in science. And I'll pass it off to Emily to go over some of those practical supports for shifting to 3D learning.
Thank you, Daniel. This gap is big, DCI only to going to three-dimensional, but it is possible. And that's kind of what we want to spend this next part of the webinar discussing. I also just wanted to throw out there when you're in the chat, if you could make sure that your little blue box is to everyone rather than just hosts and panelists, then everybody can see your responses. I think there were some responses I was reading out loud that were just to me and I didn't quite notice it. It's just nice for everybody to get a chance to see what everybody else is thinking too. But back to the conversation at hand. So this is a big shift. So what can we do to help support it? The National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Math published a guide to implementing the next generation science standards, which listed 4 key recommendations to help specifically with instruction. Because at least for me, when I was in the classroom, that felt like the biggest hurdle was, I understood it, it made sense, it sounded great, but what does this actually look like in practice? And what does support look like to make that actually happen? So, the first recommendation is to communicate and support a vision of instruction that is consistent with the NGSS. And I'm going to go into detail with all of these here in a minute as well. But essentially, what this means is really when it comes to successful implementation, it really does need to have that top down. So, somebody needs to be able to have this vision of what it should look like from K through 12 within a district, within a school, whatever it may be, and then communicate that vision clearly and then support that vision. Part of supporting that vision is also making sure that we're supporting teachers in making incremental continuing changes to improve instruction. This is not a scrap everything and start over situation. No, we need to make small incremental changes that will eventually help lead to that vision. And not only that, but celebrate what's already being done in the classroom that is currently supporting that vision. Because teachers have been doing a lot of good work for a long time. So celebrate what is working and then working on making those small tweaks over time. Another recommendation is making sure that a classroom culture supports that new vision of science education. So, what does it actually look like in the classroom? What's expected of students? What's expected of teachers? Do students know what they're going to be expected to do? And is this going to be different from what they've experienced before? So, really thinking about what that day to day looks like is key. And then the last recommendation from this guide to implementing the NGSS is making sure that assessment is a part of instruction. So rather than just seeing assessment as a means to an end, we need to think about how that can be incorporated throughout the entire instruction. 1, for exposure, and 2, so teachers can make adjustments to instruction in real time as well. So we're going to go through all 4 of these recommendations more in depth one by one. The first of which being communicate and support a vision. So what do we actually mean when we say that? So the guide to implementation of the NGSS says that regional and local science education leaders should establish and clearly communicate a vision of science and instruction that is consistent to ensure that their actions, policies, and resource allocations for science education are aligned to supporting that vision. All right, so what does that look like? So what this means is that leaders should start with a clear learning progression that shows how students will build their understanding over time, all the way from K to 12, while also mapping out for educators what standards are being emphasized at what points, what standards are being revisited, as in it's been covered in an earlier class and we're reteaching and reinforcing it, and also what are we going to be assessing over time. So really, you need to kind of start off of what do I even want this to look like? What is the goal? What's the vision? And that's really that first step if you really want that successful implementation to take place. So within the NGSS, Appendix K talks about how you can map out this vision. So a shared NGSS vision does need to be more than just a list of standards. It needs to be a clear plan for how student understanding develops over time, especially in middle school and high school. The NGSS, the performance expectations are lumped as all middle school and then lumped as all high school. So as you are mapping out your course guide, you really need to focus and decide which performance expectations are being taught at which part in the sequence. And then not only that, again, which ones are being revisited, which ones are being emphasized throughout that time. So an example of what that could look like is first just looking at like the key DCIs. So just those overarching DCI components and asking yourself, what do students need to know before they know something else? Or what will be foundational to help support this? For example, before students really can understand molecules to organisms, they should probably know what an atom is and what a molecule is. So, initially building that foundation from atoms and molecules to then going from molecules to organisms to then going to biological evolution and talking about how changes can have those large changes over time. So, this would be kind of that first step is like looking at these really big key ideas and then deciding what do we need to touch on first and then what we'll build on after that. After that first initial mapping, then it gets a little bit dicier. But if you notice here, we still have PS1, but now we're breaking it down to PS1A and PS1B. So now that we have this idea of matter and interactions, now we're going to break it down into those like subgroups within the DCI. And again, see what's key from here, what's supporting at the next level, what do we need to revisit from that earlier level to make sure that students are ready to go with this new information, etc. And then once this is mapped out, then you can really start looking at those individual standards. You can talk about what appears multiple times, what is being connected or built upon from an earlier grade level, what's being repeated, and being able to share this vision can help teachers, one, understand what their students should be coming in with, and then two, help them understand what they're going to be reinforcing and revisiting, what's new, and what is essential for them to communicate for them to be able to move on to the next step. So when we're talking about communicating and supporting a vision, first you need the vision, and then after that, you need to be able to communicate this. So you need to be able to package this up and share this with your educators in a way that they understand the progression that all students are going to go to through K through 12. So once that vision is created and effectively communicated, which I just want to acknowledge is a really huge first step. So once that first mountain is climbed, the next thing from there is then to ensure that we're supporting teachers in making incremental and continuing changes to improve instruction. So, what we mean by that is administrators, science specialists, resource teachers, whoever's supporting classroom teachers need to understand and adopt the new vision for science learning and instruction through incremental and continuing changes to instruction. They should be providing teachers with the curriculum resources needed to support this vision. So, once it's communicated, then teachers need the resources to make it happen and the understanding that these are going to be incremental changes over time. So, what this could look like is rather, again, than trying to improve everything all at once. Leaders can help teachers identify a few high leverage standards and practices to focus on, and then strengthen existing instructional routines and make steady progress toward the vision of 3D learning. So by choosing a few high leverage standards at the beginning, that is one way to, one, kind of have the most bang for your buck, if you will, while two, making sure that you're taking this one step at a time. So I want to talk a little bit about what that might look like. One of the suggestions or strategies that we've shared here at Inner Orbit is picking some high leverage PEs that align with how frequent certain SEPs and CCCs are within a grade level band. So let me show you what that means. So right here, and we're going to go ahead and drop a link if you want access to this guide. You can go ahead and access it from there. What this resource has is it will tell you how frequent SEPs and CCCs pop up in performance expectations within certain grade level bands. So what I mean is when you look at all the middle school PEs from the NGSS, 15 of those PEs have developing and using models, and 15 of them have cause and effect. So if I'm looking at trying to give supports to teachers to implement my vision, and I'm looking at my middle school team, maybe picking developing and using models and picking some PEs that have that SEP is a great place to start making that incremental change. Because what that means is that SEP is going to pop up a lot. So if we talk about how we want to instruct on developing and using models, how we want to scaffold it, how we want to assess it, how we want it to look like in the classroom, that is going to have a ripple effect over their entire time in middle school because that is something that they're going to be using a lot during that time. And so and then the same thing with cause and effect. So if you're picking some focus PEs, like, okay, we're going to really go NGSS heavy in this unit, and we're going to look at these standards. And if we're picking ones with developing and using models and cause and effect, that's going to naturally have a ripple effect throughout the rest of their middle school career because it's something that they're going to see over and over again. Also, I think it's really important to mention here too, that it's crucial to celebrate all the great work that teachers have been doing. If you're a science teacher, you're doing modeling. You're showing models, you're teaching students how to interpret models, you're probably having students draw models. Teachers are doing CERs. Somebody mentioned that in the chat. There's a lot of great work that is already happening that supports this NGSS implementation when it comes to the science and engineering practices specifically. So, one, leveraging what is already being done and celebrating that work. And then two, maybe choosing some priority PEs or SEPs or CCCs that are frequent, and then providing specific supports for those to start that incremental change over time. And like I mentioned, there's a link in the chat if you want to download this guide so you can see frequent SEPs and CCCs in your grade level band. We've also broken it down by content area as well. So you could look at middle school life science, you could look at middle school earth and space science, you could look at high school chemistry, etc. Seems like the guide is protected. We are going to look into that right now or very, very soon. Thank you for sharing that. It might just be a sharing setting on the Google Drive, but we're going to make sure you can get it. All right. So the third recommendation for implementing the NGSS is all about developing a classroom culture that supports the new vision of science education. So you've got the vision. Now you're working on making those incremental changes and you're giving supports to make those incremental changes. Now, what is it going to actually look like on a day-to-day within the classroom? So again, what we mean by this is that teachers should align their teaching approaches, curriculum resources, and student tasks with the vision. Principals should support the vision and work to provide the necessary resources for teachers and students. So what this looks like is 3D classrooms are environments where students are actively making sense of phenomena. They're asking questions, engaging in scientific discussions, developing explanations, using evidence. And creating these experiences requires intentional instructional design and sufficient time for students to engage in the work of science. So when we're thinking about our classroom culture as teachers, one, we obviously need to make sure that we're making an environment that's safe for students to share ideas, making an environment that's safe for students to get things wrong, for them to explore, for them to discuss and ask questions. But when we're thinking about how we're going to support educators with the shift, again, some things that we're going to see students, like I mentioned, they're developing models, they're conducting investigations, they're discussing. Teachers are in more of a facilitation role. They're asking probing questions, they're guiding students, and they're making sure that all of their students are being supported to engage in science. I don't know about you, but at least when I was in the classroom, that takes so much time. It takes time to build the culture, it takes time to build the norms, and then it takes time to actually do all of these activities. And at least for me, I would say you would have a hard time finding educators that look at this list and disagree that this is what they want their NGSS classrooms to look like. Right. Like Catherine just said, finding that time is so hard. Most science teachers will look at this list and be like, that sounds great. I love it. Yes, done. Let's do it tomorrow. But it requires so much time. So when you're thinking about supporting educators, one of the biggest things that you can do is helping teachers embrace this idea of depth over breadth and making sure that you are protecting that instructional time for them to actually be able to implement this successfully. So I'm sure we've heard depth versus breadth before, but just to kind of touch on it. And I really like this visual here. There can be a lot of pressure on educators to cover all of the standards, to make sure that you're teaching everything, to get through all of the content, to get through all of the curriculum. When teachers are doing that, what that means is they tend to cover everything lightly. So you're not going as in depth with everything. And in terms of the NGSS, what that usually means is we're not going as in depth with the SEPs and the CCCs. We're covering the content, we're covering the DCIs to make sure that we hit everything, if you will. But when we're talking about depth, what we're talking about is ensuring that we're eating the whole piece of the pie, if you will, to make sure that we're going really in depth with these standards, making sure that we're covering everything. And what that means is you might not eat all of the pie. And with breadth, you're not eating all of the pie either, but it might feel like you ate all of the pie because you took a bite of each piece of the pie, but you left half of each piece uneaten. So in a reality, where if we know we're not going to eat the whole pie, let's make sure that we're going in depth with a few priority standards rather than trying to touch on all of them. So what support could look like for this is making sure that we're protecting instructional time. We're reducing that pressure to cover everything If we already know we're not going to have time to cover everything, let's take off that pressure and let's focus on that depth. Going back to focusing on those priority PEs, if you really look at that vision and if you look at what is foundational at this level for them to succeed at the next level, and if you communicate that vision and say, we really need to make sure we hit these practices hard so they're ready for the next level, we're clear on the vision, we're supporting the depth, and we want to celebrate that depth of thinking as well. And thankfully for us, research supports this. So, a study done by Ty showed that high school students who study fewer science topics but study them in greater depth have an advantage in college science classes over their peers who study more topics and spend less time with each. So the research supports it. It's a reality, so let's support that reality. All right. The last recommendation for implementing NGSS instructionally is to make assessment part of instruction. So, what does that mean? Teachers should incorporate performance tasks, open-ended questions, writing tasks, student journals, discourse, and other formative assessment strategies within their instruction. These activities should be embedded in ongoing classroom work during units and used to obtain information about students' learning in science that can inform further instruction and provide feedback. What does that look like? Essentially, assessment isn't something you do just at the end of the unit. It's something that you're doing consistently and usually informally. So, listening to discussions, looking at little writing prompts, watching them investigate, facilitating an activity, all of those things give educators opportunities to identify strengths, uncover misconceptions, and then adjust instruction while learning is still happening. So while we incorporate assessment into instruction, it doesn't always need to be a formal, like sit down pen and paper test, but we should be consistently gathering data and gathering information to make sure that we're adjusting instruction in real time to make sure we're supporting students with where they're at. And this is where I'm going to take some time to talk a little bit about how Inner Orbit could be a support for this. Now, Inner Orbit doesn't need to be a specific support. Inner Orbit is one tool, it's one vehicle, but the vision is the same across the board. We really want to do our best to offer low stakes sense making opportunities within instruction. Here at Inner Orbit, we've developed something called our assessment orbits with sense making practices, individual assessments, and then common assessments at the core. The idea behind this is sense making practices are a good first orbit, meaning it's a good place to start. It's that informal sense-making assessment. It could be discussions, it could be formatives, it could be whatever you want, but this is a place to kind of initially start gathering some data and some information before you kind of get to those more traditional assessments. At Inner Orbit, one of the things that we've done is we've actually developed some specific sense-making practice activities. These are activities that are designed to be low stakes, informal, easy entry points for students to start practicing sense making and implementing the NGSS in a situation that is not as formal. And the teacher can then get some data to then adjust instruction. Julia just went ahead and dropped a link for our activities packet in the chat. I'm going to talk about one of these activities a little bit more in depth just to give you an example of what this could look like. But if you're interested in learning about any of these or trying any of these out, that sense making practice activities guide is going to be a great place to go. So, what is question of the day? This is a way to incorporate assessment into instruction. This is doing a question a day about an inner orbit phenomena that slowly builds in complexity. The goal is to almost establish a routine. So it's like we're going to do a little bit of sense making, a little bit of new novel phenomena every single day. And the best one about this is it's short, as we're talking about time. This could look like a bell ringer. It could look like an exit ticket. However you would want to kind of create the routine of this is up to you. But the idea is that this would be short. How this would actually be implemented is you would look at a performance expectation. So you would look at a standard that you're currently teaching or that you've taught and you want to reinforce, or maybe one that you want to revisit because you know that it needs to be revisited to help students master what you're going to cover in your course. After that, you pick a phenomena. So we always suggest picking a phenomena that is novel to what you're discussing in class. So if your curriculum has an anchoring phenomena already about gorillas, don't pick gorillas. You want to pick something new so students can practice applying what they've learned to those new situations. And then we recommend building a 5-question assessment and questions that slowly build up in rigor. So a one-dimensional prior knowledge question, a one-dimensional DCI only question, a two-dimensional question with the DCI and the CCC, a two-dimensional question with the DCI and the SCP, and then a three-dimensional question. Just to give you an idea of what this would look like. So this prior knowledge question would be like on the first day, if you will. Which of the following describes a healthy ecosystem? This would be a multiple choice question. I eliminated the choices just to make some room on the screen. But this would be referencing prior knowledge, so something they would have learned at an earlier grade level. Then the next day, you could talk about some non-living factors that might affect the condor population, which is the phenomena. Then you might talk about what you might predict will happen if scavengers like condors went extinct. So this is getting at that cause and effect idea. Then we're going to have them look at some figures to try to analyze some data because the SEP is all about analyzing, interpreting data. Before on Friday, we asked them to do it all together. From here, then you could go over all the answers. You could talk about the thinking. You could talk about it one question at a time. But you're kind of slowly scaffolding this understanding before they try to tackle one on their own at the end of the week. I also just wanted to take an opportunity here. We're going to drop in the chat one more time another link to our interest form. This is our inner orbit pilot interest form. Like Daniel mentioned, a lot of you are probably out of school, so you probably don't want to start a pilot tomorrow. But really what this is we'll give you an email that'll give you some more information about inner orbit and either guide you to how you can make a demo account to explore the site on your own, or you can find some time to either talk to Daniel or I about what this could look like in your district and how you could even potentially try this out in your district next fall. So those were that was a lot of recommendations, a lot of details. But the main thing here that I want to stress is if you kind of begin by establishing that clear vision and communicating that vision, supporting those incremental small changes and celebrating what is currently being done, then focusing on what our classroom is going to look like and really protecting that time and celebrating that depth over breadth, and then incorporating assessment into instruction, you really can implement the NGSS and have a big impact on both teachers and students, which is what Daniel is going to touch on here to close us off.
Thanks, Emily. Now let's take a few moments to talk about what happens when NGSS implementation is well supported. The research is pretty clear, and I want to show you all some studies that reveal what's actually possible after NGSS implementation. This here is a quick look at the studies behind the findings on the following slides. They show shifts in pedagogy, they show proficiency scores increasing, and cross-content or interdisciplinary improvements. And so for the first one, it is a study from Walters in 2018. It says when districts gave teachers aligned curriculum, real PD, and a professional community, teachers changed how they taught. They shared ownership with the students instead of just delivering content, and the results flowed straight to the kids. So better behavior, stronger vocabulary, and more collaboration with their peers. So it's evident that the investment in teachers from the districts is ultimately an investment in the students. The next study, we wanted to be sure to highlight this one, especially for those of you who are here who may oversee other subjects in addition to science. This study from AFT, American Educator, found that after 2 and 3 years of NGSS implementation in science classes, math scores actually went up 14 to 20 points, ELA up 8 to 9 points, and English language learners up 26 points in just 2 years, and it's still an increased improvement after year 3. There's improvement across subjects and for different learner demographics as well. And for the other study here, what we can see is that NGSS was designed for all kids, not just for some. West Ed found that integrating science into early literacy actually helps both literacy and with science. Every bubble in this web represents a student population NGSS was explicitly built to reach, helping to create more equity in science and education. That's about all we have for today, everyone, and we appreciate you joining. I'll pass it off to Emily to wrap up the webinar.
Thank you, Daniel. So our goal here today was to help educators better understand why the shift to three-dimensional learning matters, and then explore those practical supportive strategies for actually helping teachers implement the NGSS aligned instruction with confidence. So this is a nice graphic that kind of just covers everything that we talked about. So why the shift matters, why it can be challenging, and really what I want to leave you all with is what helps. So again, looking at this idea that you need to communicate a clear instructional vision, support teachers with those incremental changes, then support creating a classroom culture that prioritizes sense making, and then also making sure that you're integrating assessment into that instruction as well. As Daniel mentioned, that successful NGSS implementation can have a lot of profound impact, not only with just science instruction, but with engagement with other domains and with other areas, and as well as with multiple different learners. Really, the thing that we want to leave you here with today is the goal isn't perfection. What we want to be able to do is create more opportunities for students to think like scientists and engineers. So, at the very least, if we're giving some more opportunities for students to do that, we are helping them be able to expand into this current world that we're living in. Thank you again for being with us here today. We're ending 7 minutes early. Look at us. There's just a few things that I want to leave you with. Again, we have our interest form in the chat. This is our pilot interest form. We know that now is not a fabulous time to pilot, but by filling this out, we will reach out to you about how to explore inner orbit. We can talk about setting up a meeting if you want to talk about maybe formally piloting inner orbit in the fall, either with your classroom or even with your entire district. We want to be able to give you an opportunity to really try and explore this to see if this is something that suits you. We post our webinars and other resources to our YouTube channel all the time. So please head over to @InnerOrbitNGSS if you want to check out more of what we do. You're also welcome to email us at any time at inquiries@innerorbit.com to learn more. Again, I want to thank you for watching. Thank you for tolerating all of the gifts as well.